Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And today is Wednesday, January 13th. And so it is Mercury's day. And in fact, it's 1:30 Eastern time here. So it's a second of Mercury's hour as well. And Mercury happens to be culminating at the local midheaven at the moment. So it's a wonderful time to preview the upcoming retrograde. It's been a very interesting journey as a professional astrologer to really learn what that is actually means and what it's all about. For a long time, it seemed like there was a certain set of sort of simplistic ideas that were repeated over and over again, and to the point that you had people out there who had relatively little experience, in fact, almost no qualifications as an astrologer, who were writing these articles about Mercury retrograde and what to do about it, because the information regarding it had become so simplified and, in my view, ridiculous. I'm really happy to see that to some degree that seems to have, that seems to not be the case so much anymore, because what I have found is that the retrograde is in fact one of the most complex phenomenon that we have in terms of planetary motion. That retrograde motion is the part that's really hard to wrap your head around. Not only the mechanics of it, but the meanings of it, and the metaphysical meanings of it, spiritual and psychological and material meanings of what's going on, right? And so I thought the first thing that I would do before we get into the specifics of this upcoming retrograde is to kind of give an overview of what the heck is a retrograde and what it really represents. Because in my opinion, the vast majority of astrologers out there are still not yet fully up to speed on what retrogrades truly are. There's a lot of new information that has yet to be integrated into the standard dogma of what retrogrades are. And so the textbook, ideas that are out there need updating. And so that's what I want to do today, is to try to share with you the most updated version, even though it may not be in any textbook yet, and you might not see people repeating it ad nauseum. I think that it is actually the cutting edge view of what it's the best model we have of what the heck retrogrades actually are. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And for those of you who may be listening on the podcast just on the audio version, if you want to tune into the visuals, you can check out all of that on the YouTube channel. There's a link on my site for that. You can just search my name and/or Hermetic Astrology Podcast on YouTube as well. So as I said, this information that I'm going to share with you is the result of some very intense and laborious research that I've done over the course of the last 10 years, really. I first started presenting this material to the public in 2017. And over the last few years, I've been putting more and more of it out there. And so this is sort of the this is a synopsis of a lot of that work that I've been doing over that time. So we hear a lot of talk about exploding the binary, yeah. Um, Mostly vis-a-vis gender. And while that seems to be popular and useful, we don't see the same ideas applied in other areas, such as politics and even astrology. Unfortunately, the binary is blatantly obvious with respect to retrograde motion. You have a binary of good, bad, benefic, malefic, you know. In other words, even though it may not be explicitly stated as so, it certainly is in the classical literature, and we'll talk about that more at some point. But even if the modern people, you know, have supposedly purged themselves of, you know, judgmental language such as benefic, malefic, when you listen to people say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other, Mercury's going to retrograde, don't. I mean, that's pretty much saying that they're expecting a negative experience, right? So that's malefic. It's pretty obvious. It's de facto benefic, malefic, if not explicitly stated as such. This is the joke that I like to make. There's a sign that says, Mercury is retrograde. Don't sign anything. Don't buy anything. Don't get married. Don't do anything until it's over, you know. And then you get these ideas of like this so-called these make-believe shadow zones that are applied before and after the retrograde, and you extend all that. And in actuality, if you do that, and if you decide to actually apply all these don'ts to your life, that's more than 50% of the time. We can't go around living 50% of our life in fear of something that might happen. Obviously, that's no way to live. So that's when it became obvious to me that there's got to be a better way. And as I said, I spent about the last 10 years really figuring out what that better way is, and it's it's a lot more complicated than simply forwards and backwards. So I use this diagram of a cylinder to demonstrate that, you know, you can, two people or two parties, groups of people, whatever you want to call it, can look at the same exact shape. And if one is looking at it from the side of the cylinder, you know, head on, they'll see a circle. And if one is looking at this cylinder from the side, they'll see a square or a rectangle, right? And you know, hold that cancel button for a second, but both sides are right. God forbid that I say that. Somebody's going to be ready to cancel me now for sure. But both sides are actually correct. Both views are correct. Both views are accurate representations of that point of view. Sadly, that's not the case in politics. I don't think either side is an accurate representation of the view they're supposed to represent. But alas, I digress. Be that as it may, this idea that the picture of reality we get depends very largely upon the point of view that we adopt with which to look at it. As a photographer, for instance, if I go out with my telephoto lens, I'm going to be restricted to certain kinds of images where, you know, if you see me now, I'm holding my hands up, you know, there's a very small portion of the frame that I'm able to capture. If I get my wide angle lens, I'm able to capture much more of the scene, right? It's the same idea, that the tools and the point of view that you adopt in looking at something dramatically affects the outcome and the output. And I think the problem is that there's some tools that have been around so long and have been used, so they're just sort of the default setting, and people don't even realize that that's a choice. It just is, you see. Right now, the default setting, at least in the West, for most people, is what we call the tropical zodiac. This is the 12 signs, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, so on, where the year is divided up into 12 signs. And this is an equal division of the great circle that we call the ecliptic. But this is by far not the only view that astrologers have used to represent the sky. Before the Greeks came along, the main plane of reference for astrologers was the horizon. For both Egyptian and Babylonian, Mesopotamian astrologers, their main frame of reference was, can I see the star at this point in time? Is the star visible to my eyes when I climb up on my ziggurat and look out over the horizon, right? And they would watch for when the star would come into visibility, when the star Sirius arose out of the sun's beams. This coincided with the flooding of the Nile, and so this magical correspondence was seen of this star coming into view and the life-giving floodwaters arriving was seen to be the beginning of the year. So you see, there was no zodiac within which necessarily to couch that. It was about this journey of a star through its cycle of visibility through the year, you see. The Babylonian area, the Mesopotamian era, the Babylonian era, ERA, and the Mesopotamian area, because there were actually many other cultures than the Babylonians there. They're the ones who invented the idealized or sort of 360-day year as a calendar. They didn't use it in their astrology, actually. As I said, they were more interested in, one of the first records we have, astrological records we have, is called the Venus tablet of Amisadukwa. Amisadukwa was a king back in the couple centuries back, BC, long time ago. And he commissioned a series of observations. And all the tablet says is Venus appeared within such and such constellation on such and such day. After this many days, she disappeared in this constellation. And then after so many days, she reappeared in this constellation. And then after so many days, she disappeared again. And and that's the only thing that we have, is the appearance in the sky and the disappearance. They did note the constellations within which this happened. And so they were tracking it against the background of the stars, and that later became the foundation for the formation of ephemerides. That's how the Babylonian theory of planetary motion, where they began to understand all the periods, the synodic periods of the planets, and be able to predict their positions over time. We have the Babylonian astronomers, astrologers to thank for that. And in fact, it's a really good thing, because the Greeks largely did not do a lot of that. They basically took, some might say appropriated, others might say integrated that information into their own view, and using all of that sophisticated cyclic knowledge and ability to predict the positions of the planet, then they pasted that onto this idealized 12 sign division of the ecliptic. So there's a fundamental shift in the main plane of reference from the what I call the traditional period of astrology, which is that before the Greeks, into what I call the classical period, which is Greek and later Persian, medieval, etc. There's a diagram showing how that the ecliptic plane is actually tilted in reference to the horizon of the Earth, and that depends. That amount of tilt depends very much on the latitude upon the planet at which. So there's a different degrees of tilt at different geographic latitudes, and so some stars that are visible, for instance, the way we know that the Greeks weren't as particularly Ptolemy. Some people think that he basically copied the observations of Hipparchus, because he talks about stars that were either visible or not visible in his area, but were in Hipparchus's area. And so this idea that the horizon defining the way that we think about the sky, shifting to the ecliptic plane, or the ecliptic plane, and an idealized form of the ecliptic plane at that, a highly idealized form of the ecliptic plane. When you actually look at the sky, and I'm showing a sky map of the sky for tomorrow night, January 14th. If you have a very clear sky and a very unobstructed horizon, you should be able to see Mercury and the new moon, the new crescent moon. Both of them will be in the constellation of Capricornus. And if you have a really good viewing conditions, you might be able to see Jupiter and Saturn just below that. Jupiter and Saturn are very close to getting swallowed up into, they are actually what we would call under the beams of the sun. If you do see them, they will be in that last little bit of orange glow before the horizon. And then Mercury and the moon will be just into the blue part of the sky as dusk is falling. And so in this case, the ecliptic plane you can see is at something of an angle here. In this time of year, the angle is relatively shallow is relatively steep in the evening, and so this makes for good viewing conditions for evening sky Mercury. But in the morning, the angle is actually rather shallow, so it's a bit more difficult to see Mercury in the morning at this time of year. In the fall, it's reversed. It's harder in the evening and easier in the morning. The ecliptic is actually it's something like a hinge and constantly rotating over the course of 24 hours, you see. But that idea of the ecliptic moving and being at a shallow or steep angle, all of that disappears when you have this idealized version of the tropical zodiac. And the reason why is that the tropical zodiac, the horoscope wheel in any event, is essentially a supernatural view of the ecliptic. Supernatural in the sense that you can't actually see that viewpoint in nature. It doesn't exist. That viewpoint it's an idealized form projected through the power of the human mind, and it's projected from point of view of what's called the ecliptic North Pole. So it's essentially a God's eye view, if you will, of the ecliptic from far above, looking down upon it. So that this thing that we were looking at from the side a minute ago is now being looked at from way over here and looking down upon it. So this is a radically different view of the heavens that we're talking about. And because it's a top-down view, any of the vertical movement that is present gets squashed flat. We don't really, well, in the beginning there was some accounting for that, but it kind of just got lost to the sands of time. By and large, most astrologers pay little to no attention to the vertical movement of a planet vis-a-vis the ecliptic. We're going to get to that in a minute. We're going to try to correct that situation. But what you need to understand is that from point of view of the north ecliptic pole, there's this, we're looking at this flat plane. And so, and because this flat plane only tracks movement on the east-west axis, we can't see north-south from this point of view. North-south gets squashed flat, and it literally appears not to exist. And so because of that, all retrogrades get basically treated the same. It's like there's this back and forth. I call it the squished S. You see this diagram over and over again. People saying, oh, the retrograde's like this. It goes over and then it comes back and then it comes over again. Well, to some degree, that's true, strictly speaking, from a longitudinal perspective. In this particular retrograde that's coming up, beginning on January 30th, Mercury will station retrograde in the 27th degree of Aquarius. It'll go back to the 11th degree. And so there's a certain section of longitude there that will be traced over. But this is a vastly simplified view of what's actually occurring. It's useful in some respects, but it's vastly simplified, and it's the product of one point of view, and one point of view that is very different from the original point of view, I might add. So from this point of view, from the ecliptic North Pole, i.e. the tropical zodiac, or you know, what's my sign kind of horoscope kind of dealio. Because the lights are always direct. The sun and moon never move retrograde, and the planets are direct most of the time. Direct motion essentially refers to what we think of as normal. And I mean normal in the sense of average everyday kind of deal. Because normal actually changes quite a bit over time. What's considered normal today certainly wasn't normal 10 years ago, and definitely not 100 years ago, and so on, right? So that's constantly changing. So it's a relative condition. But a direct planet is moving and operating in the normal flow of things. It's going pretty much along with the currently established socio-cultural norms, for better or worse, depending on whether those norms are actually helpful or healthy. Retrograde motion then, because it's much more rare, and because it goes against the flow of the normal direction, signifies a deviation from and or a challenge to one or more sociocultural norms. So retrograde planets were seen actually in early Hellenistic lore. They were literally considered not fit to conduct business. This is getting into a little more technical jargon, but for instance, a planet that is in its debility, that's in a sign that it doesn't agree with and it has a hard time operating in, it could still be a ruler. But a planet that's retrograde was not even fit to be considered. A planet in debility, it could still rule. It might be a weak or ineffective ruler, but it would still be allowed to rule. Whereas a retrograde planet, not fit, not, out of there. So this idea of benefic, malefic, good, bad was definitely implied, at least in the beginning. And as I said, whether or not we want to, dress it up with different kinds of languages, ultimately, a lot of times people are using scare tactics, and that essentially implies a negative experience, which is to say, malefic, right? I would say that if direct planets are more in line and more generally in line with the sociocultural norms, that retrograde planets represent a countercultural response. And again, a countercultural response may or may not be helpful, but it is countercultural. It's a reaction against the norm. So what does this look like in our experience? Since retrograde motion is going against the flow of normal and signifies a deviation from or a challenge to normal, it's not surprising that many people find the experience of retrograde motion to be disruptive. You hear people all the time going, OMG, such and such planet's retrograde, and there's this disruption in my life, this is not surprising. Going against the flow is disruptive, as anyone who's ever done it or experienced someone doing it can tell you. The question is whether or not disruption is in and of itself a bad thing. And as I said, that depends quite a bit on whether or not the norm that's being disruptive is indeed healthy. If normal means responding to the plethora of advertising, selling us junk food and sugary snacks, then going against that is certainly not just desirable, but actually the healthy choice, right? Even if it's a challenge, one of the only things I watch on TV anymore, I watch sports, I still watch football. It gives me and my old man something to talk about mainly, but it's a long tradition and so forth. And one of the hardest things for me is all the advertising, the bombarding of and then I can just feel it's like there's a subliminal message behind that stuff, because it's like I can feel my stomach will actually start rumbling, like, oh man, give me some of that. It's like I have to either look away or turn the volume down or something, right? Because it's hard actually, to manage to go against the prevailing winds. It takes work. It takes a conscious effort in sailing, they call it tacking, when you tack against the wind and you have to kind of go back and forth. You can't go directly into the wind. You have to kind of tack back and forth. And so it takes strategic thinking. It takes willpower. It's not easy to go against. And as I said, that's just one example of a norm that we have that is far from healthy. And there are plenty of them, as we all know. So how can we use this to our advantage? Where's the transformative potential in this? And this brings up a saying that I like to remind people of from Paracelsus, the great alchemist, who said, "The poison is in the dose." For instance, and I recently had an experience of this. A friend of mine, I've said this before, not to her, but in front of her. And she was sharing with me, she was like, "Oh my God, Gary, you were right." She's like, she had a health issue, and it turns out she was drinking too much water. and it had disrupted the ratio of electrolytes or something in the electrical signals, and was and it was resulting in problems. And so you can literally drink too much water, even though water is one of the main, things that we need. Food, air, good, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and good food to eat, right? But you can actually drink too much water, and it can kill you, as a matter of fact. So the poison is in the dose. Too much, too little, equally as bad. And this is also true psychologically. Jungian psychology is based on this very principle that there are basically four functions in Jungian typology theory, calls them the extrovert and introvert. Um, are parts of this, but you have intuition versus sensation, and then you have thinking versus feeling. So these are the four types. And of these four, intuition versus sensation and thinking versus feeling, of these four, you'll gravitate towards one of them naturally. You'll just be naturally good at that one. You like it, you're comfortable with it, you just go with it, and you just go and go and go, and you accumulate all this experience, and it's your main thing, and you can just go there, and you always get what you're looking for. You always have success, blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem with that is that eventually you come to a point where you've learned almost all there is to learn about that particular way of being. And you're like 80, maybe 90% full. There's very little room left for growth, actually. And the only way you can grow at that point is to begin to explore. There's a secondary and a tertiary, and they have qualities that are similar to the dominant one. So you'll go there sometimes when you have to, and you've explored these somewhat. But there's this one that's the opposite of the way that you normally like to be. Your dominant function, the opposite function to that is the inferior function. Is, oh no, that one's weird, that one's strange. I can't even imagine trying that. Like, don't even talk to me about it. I don't want to hear about it. Yeah, that's actually the one that holds all the growth potential. The weird, crazy, unthinkable, that's where it's at. If you really want to grow, you have to begin to integrate some of that. And again, the poison is in the dose. When you're dealing with something that's that repressed, or you've avoided for that, a little bit goes a long way. But eventually, when you start to integrate that function, you become more whole, because now it's like a painter who has all the colors on their palette. Oh my God, they can paint all kinds of scenes now, right? Whereas before they might have been limited to in what they could produce, you see. So retrogrades may sometimes force us into discovering our growth potential. They may force us into our inferior functions because, the usual, the normal, which is our dominant function, nope, can't do that one. Not on the menu today. What else? What else are you going to try? Whoa, now we have to grow. and astonishingly, many times the response to growth opportunities is, no, I don't want any part of that. I just want to go along, same old, same old. Homeostasis, it's addictive, but if we can consciously realize, oh wow, I've got an opportunity here to try some new skills, to explore some new, this is a growth opportunity. That's a really powerful reframe. And it is, in fact, I think, not just a powerful reframe, but is in fact the truth, or a more true version of things, let's say. I hesitate to say anything is the truth as far as the final truth. So now that's just one way that the retrograde is challenging us to grow. by this normal everyday, same old, go along with the dominant, culture, norms, etc., just cruising along, versus countercultural challenges. What about these different, right now it's a big thing to trash various conspiracy theories. But you know what? If it takes a conspiracy theory to get somebody to see things from another point of view, ultimately, even if they don't, of course, going wholesale into the conspiracy theory and making that, your new reality, the poison's in the dose. A little bit of conspiracy theory, if it gets you to think outside of the box, might actually be a good thing now and then. I'm sure there's a ton of people out there who still think that astrology is a conspiracy theory, right? Even though it predates and is in fact the mother or parent of science as we know it, but that's a whole nother, again, I digress. So that's just one facet of how these opposites, dominant culture versus counterculture, these two things getting these, when you have, in alchemy they call it the fixed and the volatile, when you have these opposing forces and they're brought together, violent things can happen. There can be an explosion, or there can be a transformation where neither of these two things remain the same, but both are transformed into a third thing. This is the potential of this mixing, and the retrograde is kind of forcing this mixing to happen. Whereas when we're just going along, same old, we don't have to mess with any of that, you see. So let's look at, so we were looking at the round circle as one point of view. Let's look at another point of view. Let's look at it from a different angle and see what's available. If we look at, it's still another top-down point of view, but instead of looking at from the North Pole of the ecliptic, if we actually look at the system from the North Pole of the sun, from a heliocentric perspective, we get still an even different picture, and in fact, a larger picture. Because from point of view of the sun, Mercury's retrograde can actually be seen to be a penetration, or one might even say an invasion of the heart space of our system. That space between the sun and the earth, that's, astronomers call that the astronomical unit. It's the fundamental measuring unit that we use to describe distances in our system. So that fundamental space between the sun and the earth, that gets penetrated by Mercury during the retrograde. Now, this is very profound because there's only 3 planets that are even capable of doing this. Mercury's one, and Venus and Mars are the others. And so this closeness, this dive of Mercury from being far away and coming really close, this sort of, how you hear people say, the pop in, so-and-so just popped in. Yeah, you get a friend that doesn't tell you they're coming over, and they just show up. Hey, what's going on? That's kind of like what we're talking about here. It's a pop in. And so Mercury is moving from, in Latin, superius means above. So that is above in turn, meaning farther away from the earth. And now Mercury is inferius. Inferior doesn't mean less quality. It means literally below or closer than. So Mercury is closer to the earth than the sun during the retrograde. And this is a diagram that I created for that. And you can see literally how, Mercury goes from being on the other side of the sun and then dives around and comes and penetrates this space between the earth and the sun during the retrograde before going back out into the superior space. And so you get this, there's a difference in quality. There's a sort of soaring ethereal quality when it's farther away from the earth. It's like this high vibration. I did this thing one time. I think it's still up. I did a podcast with Sam Jeppy. I think um, we were talking about Venus with this same phenomenon, and it applies. As I said, Venus does the same thing. And we were talking about the difference between David Gilmour, who was born at the superior conjunction of Venus with the Sun, versus Roger Waters, who was born at the inferior. Gilmour has that very soaring, ethereal quality to both his lyrics and his guitar playing. And Roger Waters is that gritty, sarcastic, that's what we're talking about here. And so that gritty, sort of in your face, too close for comfort. That's really what we're talking about with Mercury retrograde. That something is way too close for comfort all of a sudden. And it's like, whoa, what the heck am I going to do with this? So we can think about this in terms of macrocosm versus microcosm, right? So in direct motion, since Mercury is largely farther away from the Earth and the Sun, we can think of distance as being like having an objective quality. When something is far away, we can see it clearly. We say, yeah, it's over there. It's this color. When something's really close, we wait. What? We have to stop and look more carefully because it's actually so close that we can't really see it all that well, right? So there's this sort of big picture thinking that comes with the macrocosmic view. That again, it has to do with collective views and cultural views. Whereas when something is really close, that's very personal. That's very subjective. And so truth is defined much more internally than externally at this time. And so, you might have an experience of your personal truth being at odds with the collective truth. You may have the experience of, one of these conspiracy theories being a little more true than you can really wrap your head around. It's like, whoa, what the heck is going on? How can that be? And so it forces us to see things more personally, especially where this contrasts with this more social views or more objective views. So because it involves proximity, we might be more prone to take things personally. We might need to watch for subjective overreactions. We might be temporarily unable to see the big picture because we're myopic, we're near focused, we're focused on this thing in front of us. Same thing now, this can be used to great effect. You have what's called depth of field in photography. If you focus on someone's face and then the background gets nice and blurred, we call that bokeh. And that's like a lovely effect that everybody wants to have. And you can only get it with certain lenses that have that ability for that very narrow field of focus. So, but that background's blurred, like whatever that is back there, we can't see it. It's just a blur. It's a pretty blur, but it's a blur, right? On the other hand, if we're focused really on the background, then the foreground becomes a blur. So we can't see the details. Who is that? Who is that that's knocking at my door? I can't really see because I'm focused on the street. And so it might be about actually learning to bring our focus back from collective expectations that we all operate in, like Protestant work ethic and yada yada, and like, hey, wait a second, what's in this for me again? Like, what am I getting out of this? Those are actually very valuable questions to ask during the retrograde. Um, you may not be attending to proper self-care because your focus is on others all the time. That's a very common problem with people in the helping professions. And for a lot of people, the way they practice astrology qualifies as one of the helping professions. So myopia or hyperopia. You're either seeing too much of the big picture, or is it the forest or the trees? Which focus is appropriate at the moment? So we have to the transformation here, the solution is to figure out how to choose our battles. So if there's a disconnect between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the collective reality and the personal reality, hey, I'm not sure I'm really getting much out of this, right? So, okay, ask yourself, is this a long-term deal? Am I getting sort of, for lack of a better term, am I getting the shaft for a long time here? If so, I may want to you know, see about getting out of that. Or demanding, a renegotiation of the contract so I get some better terms. If it's short term and we're sure that it's like a one-off thing, you kind of deal with it. You make whatever adjustments you have to get back to normal, and that's the thing is that if we treat all of the things that come up that way, just do whatever we have to get back to normal and then blow it off, we're missing some really valuable chances to make some more important adjustments. It may be a short-term thing that just needs to be fixed so we can get back to normal. But oh yeah, this thing came up before, and it came up before, and it keeps coming up, and oh, there's an underlying issue that needs to be fixed besides the one that's more obvious, right? And as I said, if it's really long term, then just getting back to normal is actually not healthy. You're just signing up for more abuse in the end. Okay, so we talked about two different ways that Mercury is mixing these opposites together. There's this sort of dominant culture versus counterculture. There's this collective versus personal, or big picture versus everyday reality kind of dichotomy, too far versus too close. And now we're going to look at another way that these opposites are being mixed together. There's actually 4 different pairs of opposites that are getting mixed together during the retrograde, and that's why it's so profoundly weird and but also profoundly transformative potentially. So if we return to what we said was the original primary view of the heavens, that is the horizon, we get a really interesting picture of retrograde motion. Because rather than a simple back and forth or far away and then close, we get actually a back and forth between above and below, in terms of the horizon, between visible and invisible. And so essentially in terms of the sky, Mercury retrograde is a disappearing act. At the moment, Mercury is actually just coming into view as an evening star, and then it'll make what's called its maximum elongation, its highest appearance above the horizon. Then it'll turn, and as it turns, that begins the disappearing act. Okay, and this was seen, whether it was the Egyptians who were talking about the daily disappearance of the sun. There was this journey of Ra on this barge through the river, going through the underworld, that happened, and he was sort of swallowed by the sky goddess Nut. And then came back out her vagina and was reborn every day, right? So there's this being swallowed or dying and then being reborn. There's the descent of Inanna, which is a similar myth where she goes through these gates into the underworld and then is reborn on the other side. But this visual journey of something disappearing and being, well, the star Sirius, for instance, disappearing and being reborn. This was the marker for the new year for the Egyptians. So there was this profound journey of transformation where there was this sort of mystical hidden realm that had to be traversed in the middle. And so this diagram is actually from my book. For those of you who don't know, that it's Hermetica Triptycha Volume 1, the Mercury Elemental Year. And I talk about this discovery that I made, whereby the maximum elongation is evening star, the inferior, meaning below or below the threshold of visibility, the inferior conjunction of the sun with Mercury between the sun and the earth, right? Inferior. And then the maximum elongation is morning star. So this whole journey from being visible in the evening, disappearing, going through this mystical underworld experience, the psychopomp, right? Mercury was able to go to the underworld and bring back, trying to think of her name right now, the dude with the lyre. You know who I'm talking about. And various other myths where he went to the underworld, and there was Persephone, and there was various others, and then there's this reappearance in the morning sky. So there's this dramatic shift from evening sky to morning sky, and in between there's this period of this mystical invisible underworld journey. You see, this is exactly the way that the ancient cultures would have viewed this. It was this God going on this mystical underworld journey. And so we can think about, on this dimension, Mercury retrograde is about the conscious versus the unconscious realms, right? In modern psychological terms, we can talk about the conscious versus the unconscious. So when Mercury is above the horizon and visible, what the two qualities I mentioned earlier, that retrograde planets were deemed unfit in Hellenistic literature. The other thing that would make you unfit is if you weren't visible. So a planet has to be direct and visible to be fit for business. So visibility basically refers to what we might call material agency. That is, agency being the ability to conduct business in the material world, right? So to be operative, practical, and instrumental in the material world. Visibility correlates to that ability. So when a planet is visible, getting things done in the regular, everyday, ordinary world is possible. Probable, one might even say. When Mercury is invisible, this denotes a condition where we can't see what's going on. When Mercury was visible, we could say, yeah, there he is. Yesterday he was here, today's here. So, you could draw a line between those, it's this far, tomorrow it'll be there. We know exactly where it's been, where it's going, how much movement and in what direction. When it disappears, what happened? Where'd it go? How long is this going to be? Is it, we don't know. We can't tell. Or at least we can't tell by our usual ways of measuring things. We have to rely on non-ordinary ways of doing that, whether that be intuition or our body awareness, checking in with our gut, dreaming, journeying or visioning with the third eye, etc., right? So basically, invisibility equates to agency in the spiritual world, right? And there's a reunion with source that happens when we go within, and when we travel. There's a sort of rejuvenation that comes from traveling the unseen spiritual paths, and that's the whole point of that journey, really, is that it allows for rebirth. You see. So the reframe here is that, am I dying or am I rebirthing? Is something in my life dying or being rebirthed, right? That normally, when there's something breaks down, when something's not working, OMG, this broke. Like, is this something to mourn, or is this something to embrace and accept so that it can be transformed, right? So if we're allowing, and indeed if we're making room for things to kind of go away from material manifestations, if we're, for instance, quiet, if we're more relaxed, less active, that alone, right? Listening, watching, observing rather than doing. We're making space for the inner experiences, and we're releasing attachments. We're becoming purified, which is the whole point of this inner journey. And we can reach a receptive place where something new, where we can become imbued with a new potential. But it's only when we're able to stop and become receptive that that's possible. If we're constantly fighting that thing, no, I gotta fix it, I'm mad about this thing, it's not working anymore. When you're mad and angry and upset about something that you lost, you're not necessarily in a place where you can even yet receive anything new, you see? So it's a great time for clearing away, giving away, fasting. I'm not a medical professional, so I'm not necessarily, recommending that, especially if you're on medications or, yada, yada, yada. Do your own due diligence on that. But we can fast from things other than food, right? We can fast from certain kinds of experiences, certain kinds of ideas. We can fast from Facebook, for instance. My God, if you watch that movie, The Social Dilemma, it'll make you want to fast from Facebook, because it's like, what in the actual heck are these people thinking? There's all kinds of weird stuff that's being manipulated, and it's like, I was just shocked to see, like, they showed this curve of, like, rates of suicide for young girls, and it just goes, and here's the date that social media got available on smartphones, and it's like, boom, it just goes up dramatically. And it's like, that's pretty freaking disturbing. And do I actually want to participate in that? I sure as hell don't. But how can I manage manage that? Because it is a legitimate business tool at the same time. So we may have to, like, just learn to moderate rather than just fasting. Moderation is a form of fasting, really. Purging ourselves of difficult emotions by talking to a friend or a pastor or a therapist, or you can do the same thing with yourself and through journaling. Originally they called the psychotherapy was called the talking cure. And really, it's the same benefits can be had by way of what we might call the writing cure. Journaling has been shown to have any kind of emotional expression that helps us to feel feelings that we're either afraid to feel or we're overwhelmed with. Like, just feeling it is as letting it out is a good thing. It's those things that we are not able to feel, the feelings that we're not able to feel, they clog us up. We get emotional and we get physical blockages from that. So this purging and clearing of space, this purging and clearing opens space for new divine energy to come in, whether that be from above in the form of, some people talk about getting downloads. That's certainly one way. You might think of something bubbling up from the unconscious, come through dreams or whatnot. Either direction, new energy can come in once all the clogs, the drains have been unclogged. Okay, so this above below vis-a-vis the horizon, the unconscious elements, meeting the conscious, and this interplay between the two. Another profound mixing of opposites that's going on. Tremendous alchemical possibility. And there's yet another, and this is the one that I was really shocked to discover, because I felt like, why? How in the heck did I not seen this before? So if we're looking at, as I said, if we're looking at the ecliptic from a top-down perspective, all we see is this flat circle. There's no verticality to it, because we're looking at east-west. We cannot see north and south. But in reality, the north-south is really where it's at, because in truth, although the implied truth of the zodiac wheel is that Pluto in Capricorn is one way of being, and Pluto in either Sagittarius or Aquarius is another way of being, and they're both similar, but they're not. Pluto in Sagittarius and Pluto in Aquarius are very different. Pluto in Sagittarius, Pluto is still above the ecliptic plane. Pluto pierces the ecliptic plane in Capricorn. And therefore, in Aquarius, Pluto is below the ecliptic plane. These are very different orientations to this plane that's being represented. And so you say, well, one sign, the other sign, the signs are different in terms of their meaning, but the implied idea is that it's on the ecliptic in all three places, but it's not. None of the planets are. It's very rare for the planets to be on the ecliptic, actually. They're hardly ever at 0 degrees right on the ecliptic, and that means these times when they are right on the ecliptic are especially important to pay attention to. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But yeah, this idea that these crossings of the ecliptic, this became really evident that this is important to understand this past year, because all 5 of the visible planets in 2020 crossed the ecliptic going south or north. And that's very, very rare. Jupiter and Saturn only crossed the ecliptic going in the same direction every 30 years or every 60 years. They only cross the ecliptic going either direction. They cross one going this way, one going that way every 30 years. So just any kind of crossing between those two is at minimum 30 years apart. And then you've got Venus only does it 8 years apart. And then you've got Mercury and Mars. And so the last time that all 5 planets crossed would have had to have been hundreds of years ago. I haven't actually done the math to figure out when that last time was, but suffice it to say, it's very rare. And one of the things that I, was really proud of, I wrote a series of articles for astrology.com, and it's interesting how, I would submit the article and my editor would pull a headline from it, and she said, so her take on what I wrote about Jupiter was there might be, Jupiter might affect our, what was the word she used? There might be, you know, abundance might be affected for, you know, and what I was saying is that because Jupiter was crossing going south, we might see literally, you know, like for instance, the stock market might go south. And what's crazy about that is it was within one day of the exact crossing. So I said, because, and I said this in other places, I said it as, you know, as early as UAC in 2018, the United Astrology Conference, where I gave a lecture on this topic. I said, you know, last time Jupiter went through Capricorn, we saw a downturn. You know, it's very possible we could, that's a forecast, technically. That's not a prediction. You're saying something might happen. Turns out, if you timed out what I was saying, the exact day that Jupiter crossed the ecliptic, the stock market began to drop the day before. I was right within one day. My forecast was accurate within one day of the actual phenomenon. And another thing that I said was that, you know, Saturn, I said Saturn, because Saturn is like, you know, limits and boundaries and stuff. And I said something about the limits and boundaries, you know, that we perceive as normal is going away, and it's not coming back. Well, my goodness. I mean, boundaries not being normal, you know, 6 foot distance, you know, wearing your mask and all this stuff. I mean, that was way more literal than I had imagined it could be. And so this is a very, very rich area of astronomical of applied astronomy that has very little astrology being the meaning of astronomy, that has very little astrology behind it. And it's just shocking to me that it's so. There are some few people that are working on it, but you know, suffice it to say that the ecliptic is not this flat band, and planets aren't always on it. There's in fact, or this flat plane. It's a band, and planets are constantly alternating up and down across the ecliptic plane in varying degrees. And I have here a slide that shows the technical specifications for those different degrees. The planets that are closer to the Earth tend to vary more widely because they're closer. The variations get magnified, right? If I stand on a 1 foot box and I'm standing right next to you, I'm going to be towering over you, assuming we're the same height. Yeah, we're equally tall. Okay, if we're assuming we're still equally tall and I stand on a 1 foot box and I'm across the room, it's going to be negligible. That's the difference between the inner or personal planets versus the social planets with their retrogrades. The interpersonal planets, this variation is magnified because of our proximity, whereas for Jupiter and Saturn, the distances that they move away from the ecliptic are pretty small in comparison. And so that tells you something about how different planets are going to be experienced. I mean, Venus, my God, Venus makes up to 9 degrees above or below the ecliptic plane. You know, that's almost double that of any other planet, including the moon. So Venus retrogrades have the potential for the widest range of variation during the retrograde. They can be the freakiest retrogrades to experience. So once we understand that the ecliptic is a band and that there's a north-south dimension to it, and we track and we learn to track east-west motion, that is longitude, like Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc. That's east-west longitude. Once we learn to track north-south at the same time, and I had to work very hard at this because there's no tools out there. Yeah. and I first started doing it with graph paper, and I would literally like draw these little graphs like you would do back in science class and stuff. And I figured out, yeah, there's these shapes, there's these certain shapes, and they keep repeating. And what I found was that um, these looping shapes actually there's a series of shapes that happen, and it's predictable which shape the retrograde will take once you know where that planet's node is. And its node is the place where that planet's orbit crosses the ecliptic, where it crosses the Earth plane. Once you use that as a reference point, depending on where the retrograde is from that point, it'll tell you what kind of shape the loop is going to make. So, for instance, Mercury's north node is in Scorpio. So Mercury crosses the ecliptic in an upward fashion, going from south to north latitude in Scorpio. And that's where we had the most recent, astronomers call it transit of Mercury, where Mercury literally crossed the face of the sun, and it crossed the face of the sun in an upward fashion. Right? I was making talismans at that time. I think I still have one book that I sigillized with some magical sigils at that time, which was pretty cool. Yeah, we're not going to see another transit for a long time, so that was a very rare event. And then as we go around, we can see that what we call the north bending, the place square from Scorpio, is Aquarius. So in Aquarius, Mercury makes this very northerly loop where it reaches the farthest north latitude that it ever gets. So we know that when Mercury's retrograde in Aquarius, it makes this northern loop. And as you can see, you know, I did this one not by hand. I found some computer tools finally that will do it. We can see that the ecliptic plane is this flat line here in the middle, along which we find Jupiter and Saturn and the sun. And there's Mercury. It's going along. It's kind of plugging along, you know, sort of parallel to the ecliptic, and then all of a sudden it goes like a you know, what do you call those things, the roller coaster ride, you know, a big loop to loop. So it goes up, and then it comes down and back across, and then okay, now I'm just cruising along relatively parallel and flat and parallel to the ecliptic. So there's this relative normal stage, and then all of a sudden, before it ever turns retrograde, it turns vertically. Now everybody who's ever, you know, followed astrology very much knows that sometimes, you know, before the retrograde actually occurs, you go, whoa, some freaky thing. How you go, wait a minute, but it's not Mercury retrograde yet. Well, it kind of is. And it's not because of some weird shadow thing. We don't need that. What it is that there's a dramatic change in Mercury's motion north-south, both before and after the retrograde. This is the most direct and actually observable and measurable thing that we have to explain that phenomenon. You can't actually observe or measure a shadow, you know. It's so this is the law of parsimony, says simpler theories are usually the better theories. So I think that this is a much better theory. Because we actually can see like measurable changes, dramatic changes in the motion before. And Mercury crosses the ecliptic plane on January 24th, which is just a few days after the inauguration of the new US president. So that ought to be interesting to see what happens. I remember back in 1980, which is, God, that's like 40 years ago. It was like the day of, I think, the inauguration of Reagan, that the hostages finally got released. And so, you know, there's a conspiracy theory about that one, right? That the Reagan administration was, you know, trying to keep Carter from, you know, getting that done so that they could look better, or they could keep him from looking good in October, which would have helped him in the election. Guess what? Not so much of a conspiracy theory. It's come out now that there's actual um, evidence that they were indeed trying to stop that from happening. And an October surprise for Jimmy Carter. Um, and it worked out in their favor. They got to look really good the day upon entering office, right? So there's this interesting quality there of, like, something being below the threshold and then above, like becoming more apparent, coming into awareness, right? In fact, there was all these behind the scene negotiations going on by the Carter administration that probably were really the result. It just happened to pay off for um, Reagan rather than Carter, finally. And these places where, rather than watching these station points and seeing when a planet passes them and talking about so-called shadows and stuff, I think we need to pay attention to these places where Mercury crosses the ecliptic, because when a planet crosses the ecliptic, we talked about this last time with Mars. It's as if the energy of that planet is it's like getting a shot, injected. It's like boom, it's like a direct injection, man. You're going to feel that right away. Whereas if you take a pill, you might have to take a while to digest and integrate that. I think that's a decent analogy. And so these places where the planets cross the ecliptic, in the Picatrix, they call this the Guzahar, is the Latin. Maybe I'm saying it right. I don't know. Jauzahir in Arabic. Again, if I've murdered it, my bad. Apologies. But these terms, I had a friend who's on the Sufi path share with me that the consonants in the Jauzahir refer to something becoming more manifest, going from being more subtle and not manifest to being more obvious and direct and manifest, right? So this is literally what's happening when a planet is crossing the ecliptic. So I thought that was like, wow, okay, that's really cool that the word itself kind of speaks to the phenomenon. So as I said, most of the time in that graph, we see Mercury's kind of moving along steady, maybe not right on the ecliptic, but relatively parallel to it and kind of straight ahead. And then all of a sudden, there's this dramatic change. So this steady motion on or relatively parallel to the ecliptic, it represents sort of the straight and narrow, or more or less operating to the ordinary and usual, same old day-to-day reality. And then along comes these dramatic shifts, and we're all of a sudden we're off the beaten path, right? You ain't in Kansas anymore, right? Okay, and so there's this challenge. There's this challenge to the ordinary and usual. We either need to become, or we are forced to become seekers. We have to figure out what's going on. Where are we? How do things work in this different reality? And who's got the keys to the kingdom, and how the heck do I get back home, and all that good stuff. And this literally, I think it literally correlates to, the two kinds of mythology that Joseph Campbell talked about. He talked about the way of the village, which is, there's all these myths, and it's just about, you're supposed to do this, that, and the other. And if you don't, it's going to be bad for society. So make sure you do this right, or people won't like you, or you'll get, punished or cast out or whatever, So there's these orthodox norms that need to be realized or upheld. And then there's what Campbell called the way of the forest adventure, which is the hero or heroine, goes into the special world and has to leave behind all of those rules and all of those norms, because there's a whole nother set of mysterious things going on here. And so it serves as an initiation. The ability to figure out and navigate this new weird way of being is a kind of initiation whereby the hero heroine is able to capture a certain amount of magic and bring that back with them, the boon or elixir, and they are able to then transfer that magic to the normal world and to re-enliven it thereby. So their personal transformation becomes a way of transforming and rebirthing their community and their world, you see. And there's actually, because these loops are different shapes, we talked about this one is a northern loop. Well, generally speaking, and I think in Demetra's book, she talks about this, northern latitude was seen as more quote unquote masculine in the sense of yang, that is active, because when planets are at further north latitude, they're visible above the horizon longer in the northern hemisphere. So this idea of visibility equating to agency, right? So the more visible something is, the more able it is to get things done. So there's this yang doer kind of need to go fight a dragon or go on a quest to find some the Holy Grail or what have you, whereas with the south loops, there's this need to find some kind of healing or perform some kind of magic that would be more an unseen. It would be less of a yang kind of agency and more of a yin sort of reharmonizing kind of deal. I always tell people one of the best astrology books I ever read is not an astrology book at all, but it's called, let's see, what is it called? It's called, I've got it right here. The Hero Within by Carol Pearson. She talks about 4 different ways of being a hero that she calls the warrior, which would be fire, the wanderer, which I relate to air, the martyr or altruist, which I would equate with water, and the magician, which I would equate with earth. So she talks about these different ways of being a hero or heroine, and so the northern loops might speak to a more yang way of doing that, whereas the southern loops might speak to a more yin way of doing that. And then there's these Z loops, which are both north and south. They lead to either from north to south or from south to north. And so this is about taking the established dogma and putting it to the test by applying new ideas and seeing if it holds up, and so you kind of like push the limits of the established ideas and see like what's possible when you go beyond them a little bit. Or if you've done that, if you've gone beyond the limits and you've found some new truth, then you still have to capture that somehow. Einstein had to, write about his theories of relativity, get them published, and then manage to find an experiment that would prove, what he was saying was true. And so you have to work to integrate these new truths back into the ordinary fabric of ordinary reality. So that's what these Z-shaped loops would represent. So That's a kind of tour de force of the sort of cutting edge, full on, complete view of the absolute many levels of weirdness that are going on during the Mercury retrograde. It's so much more simpler than this, so much more complex than this simple back and forth thing. There's all kinds, and so you know, Mercury's exaltation is in Virgo. So one of the things that would be useful is to say, okay, hey, there's these 4 dimensions where things are getting mixed together. Like, which one of these am I dealing with? So we can use our powers of analysis, Virgo analysis, and say, hey, you know, am I talking about, is there a problem of, you know, subjectivity versus objectivity here? Is there a problem of like dominant culture versus counterculture here, right? Is there a problem of, you know, um, you know, conscious or like material world versus unconscious or spiritual world perspective? Or is there a mixing between like this this north or south dealio where, you know, you're being asked to go off the beaten path and find and explore something new? You know, is this, you know, which one, or is it all of the above? You know, if it's all the above, okay, pick one and deal with that first, right? So analyzing like what exactly is going on and figuring out which part of these various opposites that are, you know, is needs to be addressed, can give us a tremendous, you know, rather than just going, I mean, it seems to me so much more valuable and meaningful and potentially rewarding than just going, oh, Mercury retrograde, curse, you know, curse Mercury retrograde, it broke my blank, and wah wah wah, you know. I mean, you know, we could start there for a day, maybe, you know, okay, wah wah wah, but now tomorrow, you know, what are you going to do about it, right? And so I think this gives a whole incredibly new, complex toolbox with which to play and work with this and create. And that's why I think it's so incredible. So yeah, this is just the preliminary thing before we can get into talking about, okay, what about this specific retrograde? So I'll come back next week when we get a little bit closer to retrograde station, and I'll talk to you about, okay, within this general idea of these 4 different polarities that are getting mixed up and alchemized, where are we at in this particular retrograde, right? We know it's a northern loop, so we can talk about that, etc. All right, so thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to like us on Facebook and like us on iTunes and all that stuff. If you have a moment, stop and give us a review. Those things are really helpful and meaningful, by the way. You know, stop and give a review of the book if you have a copy, even if it's just a few words. Amazon, you know, does this thing where it's like it judges the relevancy of a title by the number of reviews. Is one way that, so like, even if you just really enjoyed it, very informative, glad I read it, whatever, like that counts. So then if you go in and you type in the search bar Mercury retrograde, this book will have one more review, which means it'll show up one spot higher on the search list and so forth. So appreciate your feedback and Oh, also don't forget to check out the different options to become a premium member, where we have a magical report that's available every month, and that outlines the um, magical forecast for the month and gives different opportunities to work with different planets and stars to access their energy through prayer, and we can do, petitions and prayers. We can do charity. We can make talismans. I'm wearing a talisman for Mercury right here. I don't know if you can see, that's Mercury's face on a coin there, on a copper coin that I made into a talisman while Mercury was in Virgo. And so I give a sort of, I give, actually, the report this year is so much more complete. It's like it's got all the theory and the philosophy behind where and how magic is believed to work. And then it also gives the practical of the dates and times with which to do these things and what to do and how to do it. And I walk you through the whole ritual process of creating and consecrating a talisman if you want to. So you can, I think the report's like 27 or 28 pages this month. So you can get that for just $10 each month. And then there's another level where you can get access to years and years and years of recordings and classes and reports and all kinds of stuff that I have gathered together in an archive. And then there's another level where you can have access to my services as a consultant for a reduced rate. And that's going to be an especially valuable one at some point, because I'm finding I'm bumping up against my limits in terms of the sheer number of people that I can manage to serve and still get my work done, and making podcasts and doing writing and stuff like that, and teaching classes. And so at some point, I think that I'm either going to have to raise my rates considerably for people who are not members, and or make, like, for instance, classes and consults may only be available to members, because I just don't have that much time, free time anymore. And I have volume 2 to work on here. So yeah, so that's a good thing to consider as well. And yeah, so thanks again for tuning in. And oh, one oh, and don't forget to get outside if you can. Tonight, you might just barely be able to see. I mean, if you see the new moon tonight, you really be Hawkeye. You really got some good eyes and some good observing sights, because it's only going to be about 10 degrees from the sun. But tomorrow night, you should be able to see Mercury and the moon in the sky. And I can't tell you how much difference that getting back to that original root paradigm of, human being on the horizon, witnessing these stars of these intermediaries between the gods and goddesses, and that whole has just made such a difference. I feel like that my soul is renewed every time that I go out there. So if you get a chance, certainly don't forget to check that out. It seems like maybe because the moon and Mercury have just entered Aquarius, right? So they've just passed by Jupiter and Saturn, who recently made this great conjunction, which is only every 20 years, and it's part of what's called a great mutation, which is only every couple hundred years, where these conjunctions move into a new element, in this case air. It seems like that because the moon and Mercury are passing them by, and then they're remaining in view while Jupiter and Saturn get consumed in the furnace of the sun. It's like they're holding this energy up for a little while longer for us to consider. I found myself, I'm like, all of a sudden, I'm like really fascinated by and really examining that whole Jupiter Saturn thing more in depth. I've been doing a lot of research and taking a lot of notes. I'm going to be doing some more writing on that on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle. So it's interesting how that works. So you might find that the same is true for you, that this process of this mutation from earth into air, you know, that you had thought it would mean something, and then you experienced the conjunction and it meant something more, and then now there's one more chance to kind of go back over it. Evening sky, right? It's at the end of the day, so it can represent rumination, going back over things, you know, and um, gleaning the last bits of meaning from the experience. So that seems like, you know, the Aquarius archetype, right, is still there for us to figure out what its meaning and relevance is for each of us. And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother time. We'll have to do one specifically on just what is Aquarius. And because, yeah, there's a lot there too. All right, until next time, many blessings of Mercury, the moon, carrying the light of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. Bye for now.